Wow, this is a big one. It's a total cliche in popular culture that if you have a time machine, the first thing you do is kill baby Hitler, which I mean, makes sense. Hitler was undeniably evil and his rule killed millions. He was a very important figure to say the least, basically holding the Western world hostage for a decade as he tried to take over the European continent and nearly winning. However, my historical speciality isn't World War II, it's the Middle Ages, and it kind of annoys me that Genghis Khan killed more than twice the number of people without the aid of modern weapons, and no one wants to kill baby Genghis Khan. But that's my problem, not yours. So, what if Hitler did die as a baby? How would it affect the rest of history? What about borders, culture, demographics, or wars? That is the question of this alternate history. In this timeline, Hitler dies of a childhood disease when those were still relatively common in 19th century Austria. Hitler was a quite unimportant figure until the 1930s. He fought in World War I, made some bad paintings, and read history selectively. However, by the 1930s, we get to Hitler's main effect on history, his creation of the Nazi Party and takeover of Germany in 1933. So in this timeline, we have a void where we have to figure out what power structure would replace the Nazis in Weimar Germany. We know it wouldn't be a liberal democracy. World War I was deeply traumatic for everyone involved. The victorious nations saw declining birth rates and bad art. The losing ones saw all their previous government and society overturned and saw the rise of horrifying monstrosities of regimes replace them. After the war, the liberal assumptions that the functioning of the world simply seemed foolish. This also really wasn't helped by the Weimar Republic that replaced the Kaiser was a liberal democracy and had failed in every aspect to deal with the economic effects of the First World War and the Great Depression, thus losing the respect of the German people. In every society that lost the First World War, we saw dictatorships either the right or left-wing varieties. It's just a matter of which one Germany would choose. I'm also guessing communism or left-wing ideology wouldn't take over Germany either. Communism runs into serious issues with developed modern economies. Marx's theory of a tiny capitalist class owning the means of production, exploiting a huge proletariat, ignores the reality that in advanced capitalist economies that there is a large middle class that doesn't have a position in this theory. People like office workers, moderately prosperous farmers, shop owners, and the like. These people were technically bourgeois pigs in the communist worldview, but they really didn't feel like it, especially in the terrible German post-war economy. The issue with Marxism is that in developed economies, these people are a large percentage of the population and keep communism from seizing power. That's why no developed industrial nation has willingly gone for communism. Communism does best in quasi-serf-based agricultural societies where the tiny capitalist class owning the means of production and exploiting the proletariat translates very well to a tiny landowning elite owning the means of production and exploiting the peasantry. This is why communism has been able to gain power and popularity in Latin America, Russia, and continental Asia, and was most popular in the old southern and eastern Europe of feudal landholding and peasantry rather than the industrial north and west. Advanced economies, when they pick a totalitarian government, tend to go right-wing into fascism. The idea of returning to ancestral glory and military valor is appealing to urban middle classes with relatively comfortable lives. Also, the hatred is against ethnic minorities and foreigners rather than any class, which is an issue in a socially mobile society where someone can grow up poor and become rich, or less likely vice versa. So in this timeline, we can guess that another right-wing fascist or nationalist group would have seized power in Germany. We're getting into sticky territory predicting what they'd be like and what they wouldn't be like, and there's no way I'm going to be exactly correct. However, I can average different real-world fascist and nationalist groups to see what the most likely option would be. The Nazis are by far the most extreme of the fascist groups. Remember, fascism wasn't just a German thing, it arose all around the world independently, and if you include, in general, right-wing nationalist dictatorships, the list grows even longer. The only other fascist group that came close to advocating genocide was the Japanese, and I don't think the term fascist translates very well to Japan in general. All these fascist regimes were deeply racist and nationalistic, but none to the Nazi extent. This lends me to think that the Nazis were a statistical outlier, and if Hitler never existed, a more moderate fascist or nationalist party would have taken over Germany. This isn't to say everything would be good and fine and dandy. The Japanese, without a Hitler, were able to kill nearly as many people as the Nazis. The regime would likely be quite anti-Semitic, as anti-Semitism had been growing in Germany ever since industrialization, and has historically been a pretty normal thing. With World War I blowing away old norms of decency, the tribal hatred of foreigners and Jews would likely emerge. However, the way the Nazis deviated from every other anti-Semitic regime in history was by committing mass genocide rather than the norm, which was pogroms and expulsions. Similarly, viewing the Slavs as less developed and wanting to colonize Eastern Europe has been a German attitude ever since the Crusades, but going to the extremes of making them a lesser race and trying to genocidally kill 100 million of them was purely Nazi. Hitler was one of the few fascist leaders to make a coherent philosophy, one that in its final form was practically a religion. His dynamic power and the scope of his fantasies and dreams set him apart from other historical figures. If Hitler hadn't been a politician, he'd have made a kick-ass sci-fi or fantasy writer. In an era when those genres had the racist likes of H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Rice Burroughs, he'd have fit right in. With a less imaginative and less evil leader, would Germany have still fought World War II? Yes. The issue was that the First World War was so closely fought, with Germany having conquered most of Eastern Europe, practically knocked Italy out of the war, and was within 20 miles of Paris. By the end of the war, the Germans were still fighting on foreign soil. It shocked many Germans that they lost it all when they did. It's sort of like a really epic movie that ends very abruptly, and you're like, what? Did that really end? Was there some deeper meaning? Also, the Versailles Treaty was deeply humiliating and made Germany lick its wounds rather than that grow them. A really important and underrated event, in my opinion, was the revoking of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which forced Germany to give up much of Eastern Europe that it had recently taken from Russia. The Germans had a sampling taste of a real colonial empire, then were forced to almost immediately give it up, and the Germans ruminated on this and decided they would reconquer said empire at all costs. World War II would likely start similarly for similar geographic reasons. Poland would align with the Western powers to counterbalance powerful Germany. Germany would then split Poland with Russia out of convenience. A big factor that we saw again and again in our timeline is that Hitler consistently made irrational decisions that felt good, but on a strategic basis were quite dumb. His main skill was tapping into the human spirit, by his skill in oratory and his ability to craft a fantasy that the German people were willing to die for. However, he made strategic decisions emotionally, which people have trouble realizing is not smart. He overruled his unbelievably talented high command, who were most of the reason that Germany got as close to winning as it did. Two obvious examples were Hitler's unwarranted declarations of war against the US and Russia. Two other examples are both of Hitler wasting large amounts of men on useless territories. This tiny part of Latvia held out until the end of the war, since Hitler refused to retreat Army Group North to defend Poland since he didn't want to retreat. Another was that he sent hundreds of thousands of men to defend Tunis in Africa after the Allies had surrounded it, and thus when the Allies cut off the army from Nazi Europe, it left Italy unprotected from Allied invasion. However, there was one point in which Hitler's emotionality and reckless gambling paid off hugely. In the invasion of France in 1940, his high command wanted to strike over the North European flatlands of Belgium and northern France, the same route as World War I, where the Allies expected them. Hitler, meanwhile, wanted to strike through the Argonne forests, thus striking the Allies where they were weak. His high command thought this was impossible due to the Argonne's terrain, but he overruled them, struck the Allies at a chink in their armor, and swiftly seized France. This doesn't happen in this timeline. The Germans strike the North European plain and get bogged down where the Allies expect them. A major difference was that the Axis had realized that the tank had changed warfare completely, giving the offensive a greater advantage, while the Allies were still stuck in First World War defense-oriented thinking. In our timeline, the Germans nearly conquered France in World War I when the advantage was very strongly on the defense, and thus with the offensive gaining a stronger advantage, we can expect the Germans would have still won in this timeline, but it would be a grinding, multi-year conflict with possibly millions of lives lost. After France had fallen, Britain, probably under the leadership of Churchill, would still keep the war going, as Britain has a habit of doing whenever someone unites too much of the continent, as demonstrated by Napoleon, the Spanish Habsburgs, Louis XIV, etc. A reasonable fascist regime would not declare war on Russia while still fighting a war against Britain. Russia was in no way aggressing and was in fact sending supplies to help the German war effort. A big reason Hitler declared war on Russia was that he viewed the Russians as Untermenschen, who would fight terribly and be easily conquered by the Aryans. A fascist leader less consumed by his own fantasy would not make this mistake. Without the declaration of war against the Soviet Union, Germany could use all its resources to fight against Britain. Britain, barely able to compete with Germany as is while it was fighting Russia, would be unable to resist. Britain would likely be forced to sign a treaty acknowledging Germany's control of the European continent and returning Germany's pre-World War I colonies to it, while recognizing Vichy France's control of its colonies. Germany would likely take several years to recover after the long war in the West, and would afterwards declare war on Russia to retake the lands from the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and get some Lebensraum. The Russian defense would be greatly helped by the war starting several years earlier, which would give them distance from the 1938 Stalinist purges of the military, which killed 80% of the high-ranking officery and gave Russia terrible leadership for the first few years of the war. At the same time, large numbers of non-Russian Eastern Europeans helped the Germans in the early parts of the wars, since they hated the Soviets so much. This ended when they realized that the Nazis would treat them even worse than the Soviets. However, with a more reasonable fascist regime, the number of German collaborators would be much greater. The Baltics and Ukraine would likely even fully support the Germans. Germany would be able to rely on Ukraine for grain, the most fertile region in Europe, which the native population purposely didn't grow in our timeline to keep the Germans from taking it, as well as men and support from these regions. It would give the Germans enormous advantages. Another huge advantage would be that without Western bombing, German industry would be able to balloon to levels not seen in our timeline. Also, not fighting a Western front would aid the Germans quite a bit. Germany would likely not win an outright war. Russia is so huge that their armies would likely still get bogged down at Stalingrad, and the Russian tide would likely roll them back. The Germans, however, would likely be able to maintain a strong defense over regions with their support and keep parts of their conquests. The two would likely fight each other to a standstill over several years. The Baltics and Western Ukraine would likely become parts of the German Reich in a treated peace. I don't see any reason why the Pacific War would be different in this world. The Japanese would still try and exploit the fall of the Dutch and French empires, thus triggering the Americans, and the two would come into the conflict. However, a big reason Hitler declared war in the US to support the Japanese, even though there was little pressure for him to do so, was he viewed the Americans as a lesser mongrel race. Any reasonable German racist would look at the US and see the number of people of Germanic descent and not underestimate them for racial reasons. Just due to the size of the different countries involved, it seems likely that the Americans would still beat the Japanese. Much of the Japanese Empire would fall into American hands. Whether or not the Russians intervene like they did in our timeline and thus give Communist China a decisive advantage depends on where they would be in their war with Germany at the time. It seems likely the Russo-German War would last many years, thus allowing the Americans to seize control of the whole Japanese Empire and support the nationalists enough in the Chinese Civil War that they would win. With the nationalists in charge of China and thus no 30 years of bizarre Maoist death, China would choose capitalism earlier, and China today would be significantly more powerful and wealthier. With a continent occupied by the Germans, the British would fall under the American sphere of influence. Britain would rely on American economic aid, trade, and food to survive. With a shorter war, Britain would be less exhausted from World War II and be able to maintain control over its colonial empire to a greater extent, similarly to the French in our timeline. However, the anti-colonialist Americans, who would be their puppet masters, would force the British to decolonize to a certain extent. And we would likely see the more powerful colonies like India and possibly South Africa going their own direction, while meanwhile the weaker African ones would likely remain British protectorates. Britain would keep these regions under military protection so that Germany wouldn't conquer them. And, I've made a video about this topic, the link to which is in the description if you're interested. The world would likely end up something like this. The Americans would form an Anglo-American alliance, with the Germans meanwhile in control of much of continental Europe and parts of Africa. The Soviet Union would still be a great force over its region. All three would recruit allies from the Third World in a massive struggle with nuclear weapons, a three-way Cold War, so to speak. The Soviets and Germans would hate each other with a passion, with the Anglos siding with whichever side would appear to be weak and losing. China is a great wild card, rising to become possibly the strongest power of all by the year 2000, thus causing a great disturbance in the balance of power. The Germans would likely be quite anti-Semitic. Rather than committing genocide during the war, they would likely make life so unpleasant for the Jews that they would migrate in mass numbers to escape it. Just like in our timeline, the British would create Israel to deal with this issue. Germany would likely treat their Eastern European dominions in a typical colonial fashion. Like most colonial governments, they would tell the natives they'd get their freedom during the war to get their support, and then backstab them and treat the natives like second-class citizens in their own land. A similar parallel would likely be in the British in India, with a colonial element, as well as the Germans would migrate into Eastern Europe and take land from the native populations. The Soviet Union might survive for longer, as having the Germans on their western border would mean they would worry about being invaded again and wouldn't want to show weakness. Similarly, without a strong contact to liberal civilization, they wouldn't see a pleasant alternative to communism. However, over time, links to China on the internet likely kill the Soviet Union in the 21st century. I like to say that the German fascist state would collapse in the same way the Soviet Union, but fascist elites had none of the trouble with production and standard of living that the communists did. The main weakness of fascist states is their treatment of ethnic minorities, but this German empire isn't super overstretched. As always, it depends on the leadership, but if the Germans were smart, they'd be able to split Eastern Europe in on itself and maintain it as a colonial dominion. A big issue would be France, which seems unlikely to be willing to bow to Germany for decades on end, and is close enough to the Anglo-Alliance to get real help. Also, another interesting variable is Africa, in which I'm unsure of how the Germans would deal with it, if they'd give these colonies greater and greater independence and autonomy, or if they would try to crack down and maintain control, thus overstretching themselves. It's possible that the Germans would become more humane over time and create a sort of evil European Union that would give all of the members, France included, incentive to remain. However, in general, the German Empire would survive if they moved towards cooperation and moderation. It would have fallen if they stayed with racism and exclusion. Whatifalthist, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that timeline, please comment, like, subscribe, stay tuned, and check out my Patreon. I've got all sorts of new content. You can see some of my specially made maps and read the first chapter of my history of the world. As always, thank you for watching and have a great day.